The Muffin Man?
The Muffin Man.
Yes, I know the Muffin Man. Who lives on Drury Lane?
Well, she's married to the Muffin Man.
The Muffin Man?
The Muffin Man!
We grab one when we need a quick meal, and it's there individually wrapped behind a glass sliding door. We might pick up a pack from a supermarket, or spend a lazy Sunday evening whipping up a batch to fill lunchboxes for the week. Muffins are a humble dish. Hey there, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sylvie and I am a baker who has been studying the science and fundamentals of this industry whilst also spending many hours in the kitchen for my website roamingtaste.com. Today we are digging into muffins, the history of muffin men, the history of muffins, and we're going to consider the 4 most popular muffin recipes globally and how the ingredients that are called for interact together to make the best muffins. We're also going to consider substitutions or replacements for certain items and how they interact or affect the overall outcome. Don't you know the Muffin Man? Don't you know his name? Don't you know the Muffin Man as lives in Drury Lane?
Do you know the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man?
Before we get to the aforementioned sweet cake style muffins that we all know and love, we have to briefly go into the Muffin Men because the nursery rhyme that is very well known and our modern day muffins are very different. With Emma Kay from her book A History of British Baking From Blood Bread to Bake Off sharing that typically muffin men sold flatbread muffins leavened with yeast and often unsweetened, which shot to popularity in the 1700s. They probably derived from early griddle cakes. In the book London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew from 1851, describing the type of people who did this job. The sellers of muffins and crumpets are a mixed class, but I am told that more of them are the children of bakers or worn out bakers than can be said of any other calling. The street sellers of muffins and crumpets rank among the old street tradesmen. It is difficult to estimate their numbers, but they were computed for me at 500 during the winter months. They are for the most part boys, young men or old men, and some of them infirm. There are a few girls in the trade but very few women, which explains why the term is muffin men.
I get it.
They did their jobs by ringing a bell, going from door to door and shouting out muffins and cakes or muffins and crumpets, and carrying delicacies in a basket wherein they are well swathed in flannel to retain their heat. People liked them warm, sir, an old man told me. To satisfy them they're fresh, and they almost always are fresh, but it can't matter so much about their being warm as they have to be toasted again. I only wish good butter was a sight cheaper and that would make the muffins go. Butter's half the battle. If you're wondering whether they made the products they sold, Henry Mayhew answers this in his book London Labour and the London Poor. I did not hear of any street seller who made the muffins or crumpets he vended. This kind of aligns when we consider that most of these vendors were young boys or old men, and actually some had infirmities, so the labour required to make these products would have been too difficult with their physical limitations. The reason they had to yell or shout to sell their products is because they were one of many street vendors at this time. There were other vendors selling things from fruit and vegetables to meat to flowers and stationery. Add in the constant click-clacking of horse-drawn carriages in cobblestone streets and we have a real picture forming of the type of environment they worked in. Despite that word picture, it can be really hard to understand the type of world that they lived in and the people who were involved in this type of profession because we don't really ever see these stories told in media. Without the stories of real people or their lived experiences from a time so different to our own, it helps that in the book A History of British Baking From Blood Bread to Bake Off, there was the story of a muffin man that really stuck with me. There was Harry Dimsdale, also a muffin man peddling the streets of the 1700s, who acquired a mock knighthood by the local community for his abilities to speak out about local matters. Recorded as being a dwarf, Sir Harry was quite a character and someone who was cruelly and frequently labelled as deformed and an idiot. A notice of his arrest for being drunk and disorderly is recorded at the old watch house near St. Anne's Church in Soho. When questioned about his behaviour, Harry responded, "May it please ye, my magistrate, I am not drunk, it is languor. A parcel of the bloods of the garden have treated me cruelly because I would not treat them. The mention of Sir Harry in that text there refers to a mock election held in 1796, where he became mayor of Garrett, a neighbourhood south of the Thames River, located between the modern-day neighbourhoods of Wandsworth and Tooting. Because it was a mock election, as per How to History on Substack, mayors had no designated power or status, but the election gave the disenfranchised a voice to mock the electoral process, encouraging a feeling of fleeting contribution to political conversation. In this sense, the mayor was a real, if temporary, representative of those who did not have a vote. These mock elections often took place around the time of actual elections, so this is another reason it gave people who had no voice a feeling of having a sense of power. Apparently, Harry did enjoy the title of being called a Sir, though he died before what would have been the next election, which it turned out wouldn't happen again in Garrett, as his was the last mock election, and Garrett was actually the place where the biggest mock elections took place throughout the country. There's not a whole lot we can find out about who Harry was beyond the fact that he was a dwarf and a muffin man who vended in Soho. And to be fair, if Harry hadn't been such an eccentric, it's very unlikely we would actually even know he existed at all. There is another facet to this story: the poverty and treatment of people who are different or who have little means is littered throughout history with cruelty. I can only wonder what Harry would have actually been like if he'd been treated more as a human being, probably not written about, and in fact, if you search his name up today, he's still called a fool. His use of the word languor to the magistrate denotes tiredness, which gives a little insight into what it would have felt like to do this job. Muffin men would have spent several hours a day carrying around their products, ringing a bell, and shouting. Add in the fact they were people from little means and very little power, and some had infirmities or were others, so they would have regularly been denigrated, and it's only too easy to understand how, like Harry, they might have felt tired and wanted to drink away their sorrows. The before times. The path from the inherently different English breads those muffin men were selling in the streets to the global modern day ones sold in almost every baked goods section of supermarkets, petrol or gas stations, chain coffee shops starts with the usual introduction: the name. The origins of the word for this quick bread, as per Wikipedia, one 19th century source suggests that muffin may be related to the Greek bread mapula, a cake baked on a hearth or griddle, or from Old French moupin, soft bread which may have been altered into muffin. Though Emma Kay in her book A History of British Baking from Blood Bread to Bake Off says the word muffin either derives from a Saxon word for a small cake, muffa, or the Old French word muffe, relating to a quick bread. The contemporary French word muffin translates as a small, round, unsweetened cake, as does the contemporary German word. So it's anyone's guess who gifted Britain the word. And Epicurious notes that you should know the muffins were once called muffins. Honestly, muffins is the most fun to say out of that selection, and it should definitely be revisited in common use. Now that we kind of know how it got its name, let's consider where they first show up on the other side of the Atlantic. According to the Encyclopedia of American Food and Drink by John F. Mariani, the term was first printed in English in 1703, and Hannah Glass in her 1747 cookbook fives a recipe for making muffins. Mush muffins, called slipperdowns in New England, were a colonial muffin made with hominy on a hanging griddle. I saw a couple of references for this quote, and both gave the fives, and I think it should actually be changed to gives a recipe. So I'm just stating that, putting it out there. Hominy, as mentioned there, are large dried maize kernels treated with an alkali to make them more easily digestible, and they have been traditionally consumed by Mesoamerican cultures throughout North and South America for centuries, or you could even say millennia, I guess. As these mush muffins, and a separate dish we'll actually consider in the Blueberry chapter, were cooked on a griddle, it's important to note this colonial muffins link to Native American dishes, particularly as Native food is not often connected connected to modern-day American cuisine. The type of muffin recipes Hannah Glass included in her 1747 book actually more closely resemble the British ones, and this aligns with what Food Timeline notes. Early American muffin recipes were quite similar, if not exact copies of English muffins. These two dishes with the same name do have a few markers that make them different, such as English muffins use yeast and were a kind of any time of day type of food, whilst it quickly became apparent that American muffins, or the predecessor to the modern day ones, are more of a breakfast food, and this is confirmed in the History of the Muffin article. The main difference from their English cousin is that American muffins consistently use baking powder instead of yeast and are typically consumed hot or warm, often for breakfast, but really at any time of day. And thanks to the writer of the website History in the Making, you should definitely put your name on there. I would love to credit you fully. They actually made a batch of Fannie Merritt Farmer's muffins from her 1896, the Boston Cooking School cookbook. Not only did these original muffins include baking powder, but the batter is reminiscent more of something we would make in the mornings, with the recipe tester and writer of that website commenting that it reminds me more of drop biscuit dough than of muffin batter. We've mentioned a griddle a few times as a way to make these old school muffins, but we know them from their specific pan type. When did we go from using a griddle or fry pan to the pan we know today? Well, at the time of Hannah Glass writing her book in 1747, the method to cook them would have been that old school griddle method, whilst times had moved on to using muffin rings or gem pans by the late 1800s, as written in the book The Old West Baking Book by Lon Walters. Muffins graduated from being cooked in a utensil called muffin rings to a special baking pans, thanks to how quickly the batter came together, and once these pans came into regular use, it became easier to serve as individual items for breakfast without requiring hours of prep work. Add in the ease of access to sugar and fruit, and muffins became something that went from being predominantly a domestic baked good to something that featured in bakeries, cafes, and diners by the mid-20th century. This is reflected in the article How the Muffin Became a Morning Staple. By the 19th century, American cookbooks were full of muffin recipes that used cornmeal, bran, or fruit. These variations made muffins an everyday food, perfect for busy mornings. The convenience of grabbing a muffin alongside a cup of coffee helped cement its role in American breakfast culture. How ingredients affect a muffin. Before we get into the individual ingredients, it's important to note that muffins come in a variety of flavors. That's why they're so beloved, and therefore they don't all have the same ingredients. So I decided to focus on a handful of websites that featured 4 of the same recipes and their similarities in main ingredients. The 4 we're going to be looking at today are arguably the most popular across the globe: blueberry, banana, bran, and chocolate. A side note that some of the recipes used in my references include add-ins that won't be mentioned unless there is a reason applicable to what I'm discussing, as the ingredients featured are for consistency of main ingredients and what gives the muffins their key texture and beloved flavor, so that we can understand better how they all interact, or even help us decide how to improve our muffins. Additionally, the main factor of the sources used was that they had to have all 4 recipes on their websites for consistency. Some of these recipes don't have a huge number of ratings, and some, according to the comments, aren't particularly great, but we're really using these recipes more for data to gain a picture of common ingredients used. So the 24 recipes in my research will be referenced throughout this video. There will be the graphs showing on screen, hopefully, and all will be linked below in the caption. Fats. In the book How Baking Works by Paula Fagoni, the following advice is given. For tender cake-like muffins, use a plastic fat and cream it to lighten. For firm, dense yet moist muffins, use liquid oil or melted fat, lightly blended into dry ingredients. The term plastic fat is used by professionals to refer to fats that are malleable, such as margarine or butter, ones that are solid when cool but can be melted. So Paula is therefore saying that that creamed butter or margarine contributes to a tender crumb and cake-like structure, whereas melted butter or oil provides moisture but does make the structure of the muffins slightly dense. Tara from the Modern Crumb compared muffins made with butter and oil and noted, the muffins made with butter had a richer taste than the ones made with oil. They also had a crisper top. The muffins made with oil had a really nice taste, but were not as rich as the ones made with butter. If you had given me just the oil muffin without side-by-side tasting the butter muffin, I would have been happy as a clam with it. The taste was really good, but if you want a richer taste, I would use the butter. The muffins made with oil had a very light and soft texture. They were perfect. The texture of the oil muffins was superior to the texture of the butter muffins. So often in baking recipes, the temperature of the butter is incredibly important and can make a huge difference in how our bakes turn out if that temperature isn't right. But as per the Serious Eats article, Classic Blueberry Muffins, chili butter will make a batter incredibly stiff, which leads to excessive doming. While that's considered a major flaw in layer cake, where the rounded tops must be trimmed away, doming increases the surface area of each muffin top, which most of us consider to be the best part. Half of the muffin recipes in my research call for butter, with a further 3 recipes calling for either butter or oil, and 1 calling for both. 6 of the 12 recipes that called for butter called for it to be melted, as did 2 of the 3 that had either butter or oil as an option. This reflects that due to muffins having minimal mixing time, using melted butter in a similar way to oil mixes more easily throughout our batter. All of the banana muffins in my research called for butter, which adds a complementary flavor to the banana, whereas 4 of the 6 recipes for chocolate muffins call for oil, and the remaining 2 call for butter to be melted, as cocoa powder, like bran, requires more hydration. We'll come back to bran in the flour chapter. Back to the chocolate muffins for a minute though. As butter is a solid at room temperature and oil is not, this ensures they aren't dry and is the reason why most chocolate muffin recipes will call for oil over butter. Additionally, most oils tend to have a more neutral flavor, allowing the chocolate flavors to really shine in a way that a butter base doesn't necessarily do. The Muffin Book website also notes that melted butter naturally solidifies when the muffins cool. As a result, they have a slightly denser texture than muffins made with oil. There are a few factors to consider when using butter or oil, particularly if you want to use one but the recipe is calling for the other. If butter is called for but it is melted, then it's doing the job of oil in the mixing stage but adding the perfect complementary flavor and also solidifying once baked. Whilst oil can provide the necessary moisture and help bring out the flavors of the star ingredients better in some cases. If the recipe you have calls for butter and you want to use oil or vice versa, it's better to find a specific recipe that uses the fat you prefer in the event your recipe doesn't turn out by making that change. Sugar. Sugar is obviously a sweetener, but it also pivotally helps balance the flavors and is hygroscopic, which means it attracts water. You might know about tossing berries and some sugar into a bowl, stirring together, and soon there is juice at the bottom of that bowl. That is the action of sugar drawing the ambient moisture out of the fruit. That characteristic in sugar can help muffins retain their moisture as well as binding with the moisture in the butter and eggs. Sugar also plays with gluten development, keeping the crumb tender once baked. If you cut the sugar by half in a recipe and that's the only change you make, you might notice that the overall result is somewhat dry. That can be because the sugar helps to provide moisture by drawing it out of the other ingredients, and without enough sugar, it's not going to happen. In the 24 recipes in my research, there were only 2 types of sugars called for the batters: granulated white sugar and brown sugar. Granulated sugar is also known as white sugar and is a neutral sweetener that doesn't add any additional flavor beyond sweetening. Thanks to the moisture from fat, eggs, and other dairies such as milk, buttermilk, yogurt, and sour cream being included in all of the muffin recipes in my research, it's clear, the granulated or white sugar begins to dissolve before the baking phase, even though most muffin recipes don't require much mixing time. The second type of sugar that is most often called for is light brown sugar, which is most often simply refined white sugar with the addition of molasses. This combo retains moisture better than refined white sugar, which helps give you muffins with a more tender, denser texture with warm caramel undertones. The difference between light and dark brown sugar is the amount of molasses, with dark having double the amount versus light brown. This additional molasses imparts a stronger flavor that isn't to everyone's liking, but dark and light brown sugars can be used interchangeably in equal measure. As stated in the book Understanding Baking, The Art and Science of Baking by Joseph Amendola and Nicole Rees, sugar in any form will contribute to crust color and browning in the oven as the sugar along the hot surface caramelizes. As the muffins bake, the Maillard reaction takes place, changing the color to a golden brown, and the sugar is a key ingredient helping to create this environment needed for that beloved color and the flavor connected to it. For bran muffins, we actually see a couple of recipes call for honey and or maple syrup, which King Arthur Baking gives some great advice on. Liquid sweeteners like honey, molasses, and maple not only affect texture, which is pretty obvious since you're swapping out a dry ingredient for a liquid one, but also flavor. Liquid sweeteners are known as invert sugars, and they have different makeups of sucrose, glucose, and fructose. As a result, they contribute varying levels of sweetness, browning, and moisture retention. In a separate King Arthur Baking article, they actually did some testing with liquid sweeteners, and the results using molasses in their muffins were: muffins made with liquid sweeteners will rise nicely and have a slightly more coarse crumb. In this case, the molasses created a denser muffin due to the moisture and created a dark brown color. The color of your liquid sweetener, because molasses is a very dark color, would obviously affect the overall color of your baked muffins, and the texture would be denser than using regular sugar. Overall, the lesson is that if you prefer a denser muffin, you can replace or do even a mixture of using regular sugar and liquid sweeteners, though they don't all equally replace sugar, so you're going to have to make sure you're doing the right conversion when making this change, as honey does not equal the same amount as maple syrup, and the same with molasses. To round out this chapter, lots of muffin recipes also call for demerara or turbinado, which is also known as raw sugar, for the tops of the muffins. These are rough, granulated sugars that bake up nice and crunchy thanks to their large granules, giving a nice textural difference to the soft interior. According to King Arthur Baking, demerara is a less processed version of granulated sugar. Demerara sugar contains some molasses, making it similar to brown sugar in taste, while in texture it's more like sanding sugar. If you don't much care for that textural difference, or you love a streusel topping, then you could just easily omit using these sugars completely on the top of your muffins. Eggs. In order to understand what they do, we're going to break an egg down into its two main parts. Egg yolks add fat alongside butter or oil and other dairy ingredients. The proteins within the yolks thicken better at room temperature to bind with our other ingredients, as well as delaying gluten development, making for that perfect texture and crumb during the baking phase. Egg whites are approximately 90% water, so the sugar will attract the water in the same way as it does with butter or other dairy components in the batter to provide the necessary moisture. Overall, eggs help to bind everything together as well as add moisture, and as they cook, they expand, which is a type of natural leavener to raise muffins as they bake and create a lighter crumb. They're also a source for our baked goods to bake up nice and golden. A whole egg is pretty much a perfect ingredient to help in all areas for the making, baking, and eating phases. It's not common, and I certainly didn't see this in all of my research, to see muffin recipes call for either egg yolks or either egg whites, so it might be better to find a specific recipe if you happen to have some spare egg whites or egg yolks lying around. Flour. There are only two types of flour called for in all of the muffins I found in my research, and that is either plain plain or all-purpose flour, and for some recipes such as bran or banana muffins, whole wheat or wholemeal, which is interchangeable as they're effectively the same. Plain or all-purpose flour has an average protein level of 10 to 12%. This can vary country to country, so if you're unsure of what yours is nationally, definitely have a look. But this protein amount of 10 to 12% contributes to a tender texture and that signature crumb that makes muffins beloved and helps in creating the perfect golden exterior, but also making sure that they are actually have enough body to them, you could say. The more protein a flour has, the easier it is to activate the gluten once moisture is added and that gluten forms stronger bonds as we mix. So the gluten formation in flour is another reason why it's often one of the last ingredients to be mixed into our batter. Not one of the 24 recipes in my research called for cake or bread flours, and this is due to what either of these would contribute if used. Cake flour has a low protein amount, which means the crumb would likely be too tender and it would also bake up very pale, whilst bread flour would give our muffins a chewier and denser texture with a slightly darker overall appearance. 4 of the 6 recipes for bran muffins used whole wheat flour, with 2 using a mixture of plain and whole wheat and 2 using only whole wheat ingredients alongside the bran. This is often an ingredient in bran muffins as the nutty texture is complementary to the bran and is higher in fiber. As whole wheat includes bran within it, it bakes up more dense and requires more moisture as it absorbs more water than plain or all-purpose flour. Out of the 6 recipes for bran muffins, we see 2 recipes: King Arthur baking, hydrating half the wheat bran with boiling water, whilst Serious Eats does this with all of their wheat bran. Out of the 6 recipes for bran muffins, we see 2 recipes: King Arthur baking, hydrating half their wheat bran with boiling water, while Serious Eats does this with all of their wheat bran. And 4 of the 6 recipes call for oil to help provide that extra hydration needed to make a great bran muffin and to ensure once baked they don't dry out, because oil is liquid at room temperature. Sally's baking addiction calls for applesauce, and Simply Recipes does the same or requires mashed banana, which reflects how essential extra moisture is to these muffins thanks to the bran and or whole wheat flour absorption. Other dairy. Most muffin recipes will call for either milk, buttermilk, yogurt, or sour cream, or a combination of any 2 of these ingredients, so we're going to consider how each of these affect our muffins. When we consider 13 of the 24 muffin recipes in my research called for milk, let's clarify the type of milk most often called for in these types of recipes. Quoting from the book Understanding Baking, The Art and Science of Baking by Joseph Amendola and Nicole Rees, if a recipe calls simply for milk, it is referring to whole milk. Whole milk has 3.5% fat and is called whole because it resembles the milk taken straight from the cow before any cream has been removed. So now we know the type. What does milk do in the muffins? It's best explained in the book On Baking by Sarah Lubinsky, Priscilla A. Martell, and Eddie Van Dame. Liquids such as water, milk, juice, and eggs bring moisture to the mixture. Moisture is necessary for gluten formation and starch gelatinization, as well as for improving a cake's keeping qualities. Basically, where one of these dairy ingredients is called for, it helps not only add more moisture into the muffins, but also interacts with the flour as it bakes to provide the right texture for that beloved crumb, as well as providing a richer flavor than say water would, and helps ensure that moisture is retained once baked. For those who cannot consume milk or prefer consuming non-dairy milk, thankfully King Arthur Baking tested out their basic muffin recipe with 6 different non-dairy milks: soy, coconut, cashew, almond, oat, and pea milks, and found all of the vegan milks proved a seamless substitute. Rise, texture, mouthfeel, flavor, and browning were the same. So whichever milk you want to use, go ahead. Now that we've covered milk, what about sour cream, yogurt, and buttermilk? What does each of these contribute in in a muffin recipe. As Neem's Kitchen in their Baking Institution post notes that sour cream adds a velvety, creamy texture to baked goods. Its high fat content contributes to moistness in cakes, muffins, and quick breads. Baked goods made with sour cream tend to be tender and soft. Whilst all recipes have a great and very thorough article entitled "Why Use Sour Cream in Baking?" Sour cream adds moisture without thinning your batter the same way that a liquid would. The fact that sour cream delivers moisture without further thinning out a batter results in a cake with a very tender, very fine crumb. Additionally, it's helpful to note the interaction with raising agents when sour cream is called for or is used in a baking recipe. For one, the acid content helps to tenderize gluten strands, the structural protein architecture in your baked goods, resulting in a more tender final product. Additionally, you'll notice that baking recipes containing sour cream often rely on baking soda as a leavener, as the acid content of sour cream allows it to activate baking soda's leavening powers. We're going to set sour cream aside for the moment and consider yogurt, or most specifically Greek yogurt, because in the 24 research recipes, only 4 call for either or sour cream or yogurt, so it's helpful to understand the difference it makes in our baked goods. Neem's Kitchen in their Baking Institution post states, Greek yogurt, especially the full-fat variety, provides moisture and a dense creamy texture. It can make your baked goods moist without adding as much fat as sour cream. Greek yogurt is less tangy compared to sour cream, making it a versatile choice for a wide range of recipes. And the article Why Use Sour Cream in Baking from All Recipes notes that Greek yogurt is often suggested as the most viable substitute for sour cream. This makes sense in that they are texturally similar, though whole-fat Greek yogurt has a notably lower fat content, more on par with whole milk and buttermilk. So when substituting, just keep in mind sour cream equals more dense and rich. Greek yogurt equals more airy and moist. Sour cream and Greek yogurt can actually be substituted in equal measure, so if you're using one or have a preference, it's best to understand what you want to achieve in your baked good. For example, a bran muffin is naturally dense due to the fact bran and whole wheat require more moisture, so using Greek yogurt would help create a lighter overall texture to the baked muffin. Finally, let's consider buttermilk. If you've ever wondered what buttermilk is, well, Sally's Baking Addiction says it better than I could. Buttermilk is fermented milk. Traditionally, it was a byproduct of making butter. The liquid left over after churning fat out of cream was left out to ferment. Before we dig into buttermilk, I'm going to say something controversial here. Homemade buttermilk is something that I've seen come up so many times in my research. People often prefer to make it versus buy it because they often have leftovers. However, homemade is never as good as store-bought, particularly as store-bought is created in a controlled environment and guarantees the right and consistent cultures needed for the best rise and overall outcome in our baked goods. Homemade buttermilk is always a great thing to use on things that are not going to be baked, such as waffles or pancakes. But for any recipe that calls for buttermilk that requires baking, rely on store-bought, and if you have any leftovers, you can always make a small batch of pancakes or whip up a batch of wonderful, beautiful, flaky southern biscuits. So what does buttermilk do in our baking? Referring to Sally's Baking Addiction once more, buttermilk's lactic acid, as well as its tangy flavor and creamy consistency, does so much for baked goods. The acid reacts with baking soda to produce carbon dioxide bubbles, which leaven the batter or dough, resulting in lighter, fluffier textures in biscuits, muffins, cakes, and buttermilk waffles. Buttermilk offers similar acid levels as sour cream, a bit more even, thus it can offer similar effects. Out of the 4 types of muffins in my research, only the bran muffins call for buttermilk, with 4 out of the 6 muffins requiring it. But you might be wondering how the fat content compares to the other dairy ingredients, which all recipes note in their article Why Use Sour Cream in Baking. Per 8-ounce cup, both whole milk and whole buttermilk contain roughly a little over 8 grams of total fat. Comparatively, 8 ounces of full-fat sour cream offers close to 45 grams of fat. Buttermilk and milk can actually be used interchangeably. However, this is where baking becomes a bit more scientific. The secret is it's always scientific. Thanks to the Spruce Eats. When using baking powder, however, take care in substituting buttermilk for regular milk, as it upsets the balance of alkali to acid. If we just decide to replace buttermilk with milk and don't account account for the loss of acid from that buttermilk, it can offset the raising agent and potentially create a different result than what the recipe suggests. So it's best to find a different recipe or do the research on how to make the recipe with the right level of raising agents. As a side note, there is a very comprehensive article by Serious Eats diving into buttermilk substitutes, and Stella, the writer, is more passionate about it than I. Raising agents. Most often there will be 1 or 2 raising agents called for in a recipe, so we're going to single them out. Baking powder is traditionally made up of 3 ingredients: a base such as baking soda, an acid such as cream of tartar, and a starch that acts as a buffer between the other 2 ingredients such as cornstarch. Because it includes a base and an acid, it will react without requiring any acidic ingredients in a recipe, but we're going to come back to that in a second. Almost all the baking powders on the market these days have a double rise factor. This means that the baking powder is first activated when moisture is added to it or it's mixed with liquid, and then the second activation or that rise takes place during the baking phase. Most muffin recipes will require you bake the batter as soon as you've made it, which means that the baking powder doesn't lose any of its raising action, though if a recipe requires a rest, it's usually calling for refrigeration, which helps to significantly slow down the reaction rate, meaning that by the time the batter is baked, it's almost the same as if you'd baked it straight away. Baking soda, also known as bicarbonate of soda or sodium bicarbonate, is a leavening or rising agent that is not acidic. So what does that actually mean? If a recipe includes brown sugar, yogurt, buttermilk, sour cream, or cocoa powder, these are acidic ingredients that help the baking soda react, creating carbon dioxide and helping our baked goods rise during the baking phase. Additionally, because baked goods brown better in an alkaline environment, which is created when we add baking soda, it means that our muffins are going to have a more golden color when baking soda is included versus when it's not. Baking powder versus baking soda. Firstly, baking soda and baking powder are not interchangeable. Whilst they are both raising agents, they work in different ways to make our baked goods successful. If a recipe calls for both ingredients, there is likely an acid in the recipe, but that chemical reaction from the baking soda isn't enough to give your dish, in this case the muffins, the necessary lift. Baking soda is 3 to 4 times stronger than baking powder, and too much can create a metallic or soapy taste in a recipe, which if you've come in contact with that taste, you might recognize it at the back of your throat. A good rule of thumb when using these raising agents is to use 1 gram or 1/4 teaspoon baking soda to 4 grams or 1 teaspoon of baking powder per 160 grams or 1 cup of plain flour. I'm just going to side note here. Some people's 1 cup of flour is slightly different gram amounts. That's why I say to 1 cup of flour. If your 1 cup is 200 grams, that amount of 1 gram and 4 grams is still relevant, or 1/4 teaspoon and 1 teaspoon is still relevant. Blueberries. I'm not going to go into all the add-ins for muffins because this could be a very long list and a very long video, but blueberry muffins might be the typical muffin you order or make at home, so it's important to consider the origins and some tips and tricks to better blueberry muffins. The likelihood of the connection for blueberry muffins and native people's traditions of cooking with native ingredients is pretty strong, particularly as blueberries are actually native to North America. So they would naturally have been an ingredient native peoples used in their dishes and then at some point tossed into muffin batter, although it's pretty hard to pinpoint when exactly this happened. According to Food Timeline, a favorite dish of the Native Americans during colonial times was sortateig, a simple pudding made with dried, crushed blueberries, dried, cracked corn or samp, and water. Later, the settlers added milk, butter, and sugar when they were available. The Pilgrims loved sortateig, and many historians believe that it was part of the first Thanksgiving feast. In a letter to friends back in England, one colonist describes how sortateig was prepared. This is to be boiled or stewed with a gentle fire till it be tender, of a fit consistence, as of rice so boiled, into which milk or butter be put either with sugar or without about it. It is a food very pleasant, but it must be observed that it be very well boiled. The longer the better. Some will let it be stewing the whole day. After it is cold, it groweth thicker, and is commonly eaten by mixing a good quantity of milk amongst it. The three main ingredients we see in this Native American version was dried blueberries, cracked corn or samp, which is a dried corn roughly crushed, and water. Once the rough pieces of cracked corn or samp are cooked for some time, they turn into a soft starch, which would have made the stovetop pudding style dish similar to actually what modern day muffin batter would be, particularly when you consider that colonizers added milk, butter, and sugar to the dish. That tidbit of information is important because it probably did lead to blueberry muffins becoming a thing, and so often it's so difficult. So often native cuisine is not even factored into what makes up American food, and this is why I'm including it here. One of the most often mentioned elements when making a blueberry muffin is to toss them into flour to stop them from doing two things. Firstly, to stop them from sinking to the bottom of the batter, and secondly, to stop them coloring the batter, which is an effect called bleeding. Many people have recipes that call for tossing the blueberries in flour to coat them before mixing through our batter. Though Serious Eats article Muffin Myth Busting, Don't Waste Your Time Tossing Berries in Flour states, while the flour does seem to minimize bleeding in the muffins, that's only a benefit if the berries are tossed with a portion of flour reserved from the recipe itself. Otherwise, extra flour will only make blueberry muffins seem dry. So if you don't toss blueberries in flour, what does Serious Eats suggest you do to avoid the blueberries sinking to the bottom of the pan? Before stirring the blueberries through the batter, they suggest putting a heaped tablespoon of batter into each muffin cup. As per this image, it's pretty clear you've got a solid portion of muffin with no fruit. So personally, I recommend using a smaller portion and then following their advice, but you do whatever works for you here. Also, if you don't care about your berries bleeding, then simply disregard this info. Chocolate. Okay, lastly, I wanted to discuss chocolate muffins, as the 2024 Summer Olympics in Paris had no greater celebrity than the chocolate muffin. It began with Norwegian swimmer Henrik Christensen's obsession with the muffins, and it becoming so viral that many at home became obsessed too. I count myself in this. In fact, by the time the muffins became so popular online, Henrik was now known as the Muffin Man. How times have changed from those earlier ones mentioned. We're going to speak about standard chocolate muffins before we get to the Olympic ones though. I spoke about the type of fats most often called for in chocolate muffins, so I'm not going to rehash here, but in my research, all of the chocolate muffin recipes called for milk, and 3 call for other dairy, 2 calling for yogurt, and 1 calling for yogurt or sour cream. This is because cocoa powder can absorb up to 100% of its weight. If we're comparing cocoa powder and flour, flour has an absorption rate of 40%. So this is why more liquid is required in a chocolate muffin recipe versus a blueberry, for example. Also, that milk helps add fat for the cocoa powder to be coated with, because cocoa powder also naturally has fats within it. Of the 6 recipes in my research, 2 called for unsweetened natural cocoa powder. 1 simply says unsweetened cocoa powder, 2 don't define the cocoa powder, and the last calls for Dutch processed cocoa powder. As there are 2 types of cocoa powder called for here and that most of us have access to, it's best to understand them as, according to Baker's Authority, they're not always interchangeable. Unsweetened cocoa powder most often refers to that natural cocoa powder that you can probably find in any supermarket, which tends to be light brown in color with a reddish hue undertone. Whilst Dutch process, also called alkalized cocoa, has been treated with a potassium carbonate solution to neutralize its acidity. The color is often dark and is often most found to be unsweetened, but when it is called for, it will always be called for as Dutch processed, not unsweetened. The key difference between the 2 cocoa powders is actually not their color, it's how they interact in our baking, as natural cocoa powder is acidic, whilst the Dutch processed one is neutral or slightly alkaline. So if you want to use one instead of the other, Baker's Authority is helpful helpful in what to use when replacing in a recipe. When replacing natural cocoa powder with Dutch process, use the same amount of Dutch processed cocoa, but swap the baking soda with twice the amount of baking powder. Whilst replacing Dutch process with natural cocoa powder, use the same amount of natural cocoa, but replace baking powder with half the amount of baking soda. Now that we've talked about the cocoa powder, we're going to set that aside and consider the fact that all of the recipes in my research called for chocolate chips. This is in addition to really intensify and add dimension to that chocolate flavor. Muffins and cakes are virtually the same in so many ways, and nowhere is it so apparent as to a chocolate muffin, particularly with that Olympic muffin with its large pieces of chocolate and the gooey fudge center. Cassie Mendita from I Bake Mistakes Substack is probably the best person to have developed a version of these muffins during the height of their popularity in 2024. If you haven't encountered Cassie's work, let me say, she is an incredible baker and recipe developer after spending hours dissecting every video that she could get her hands on, and what she created is a thing of beauty. In usual Cassie style, she provides plenty of tips for you to make the best version in your own home. Her recipe calls for both cocoa types, though the majority of flavor is reliant on one specific one. The cocoa here matters. It's Dutch processed, which gives a robust chocolate flavor, a deeper brown color to the muffin, and letting the batter rest before baking really helps with the rise and overall texture of the muffin. Time allows the starches to absorb liquids. The link for her recipe and all that information is included in the caption below under the chocolate chapter heading. I absolutely recommend you follow her. She is an incredible baker that not only is so informative, but she wants everyone to succeed and have fun in the kitchen. If you want to follow her, her Instagram is also I Bake Mistakes. Making a batch. Now that we've covered the essentials, let's talk about making a batch, because so many instructions in my research stand out and there are a few key differences between a great and a not so great muffin. Firstly, don't overmix. According to all recipes, the moistest muffins, be careful not to overmix the batter. Stir just until the dry ingredients are incorporated. And Erin Jean McDowell repeats this advice in the article Muffin Tips from a Baker Who Has Made Thousands. She's the person who's made thousands. The more you mix, the more the batter will develop gluten, those dangerous protein strands which are desirable for bread baking but can make a muffin unnecessarily tough. As mentioned in the flour chapter, the reason flour is often one of the last ingredients to be added to our batter is for good reason, and one of the easiest ways to avoid overmixing is to simply just work slowly, stir from the bottom of the bowl upwards. That's what I always think. Don't rush it.
And don't rush it.
And don't over bake. Muffins are best enjoyed if they bake for the time recommended in the recipe, and only longer if a toothpick inserted into the center comes out with a super fudgy bit, or it's fully not baked. According to all recipes, do not over bake. Remove the muffins as soon as a toothpick inserted in the center comes out with a few moist crumbs. Let them cool briefly in the pan before transferring to a rack to finish cooling, which helps them set without drying out. Additionally, many bakers recommend putting the batter into muffin tins with a gap between so that they can bake more evenly, though Erin Jean McDowell actually has a way around needing a muffin tin. To get a bakery style big ol' muffins, I use freestanding paper baking cups. They don't need to be put in muffin pans and can simply stand alone on a baking sheet, so there is no need for a special size pan to get massive muffins of greatness. If you're just getting into baking and have a baking tray on hand, you could try this method before forking out money on a tin. Not everyone has the money or even the space in their kitchens for tins or things that they aren't necessarily going to be using all the time, and this is a great workaround. Finally, if you're making a batch of banana muffins, then melted butter is ideal in the mixing phase that solidifies and adds complementary flavor once baked, whilst oil is better in chocolate and bran recipes, adding both hydration and keeping the muffins moist once baked. Granulated sugar works best in most muffins, though brown sugar is complementary in banana recipes most specifically, coarse sugars are a perfect textural difference to the tops. Those streusels are also fantastic. Where milk is called for, both dairy and non-dairy work in creating the same texture, flavor, and browning. And Greek yogurt and sour cream can be used interchangeably, though sour cream creates a denser and richer flavor, whilst yogurt creates a more airy and moist texture. Knowing this helps you figure out which ingredients to reach for the next time you want to whip up a batch. If you've been making the same batch for some time but feel it's missing something and it calls for yogurt, try it with sour cream. Or if you instinctually toss blueberries into extra flour, try a batch without doing that step, or set aside some flour to toss the blueberries through that flour. That will also avoid your muffins being dry. Baking is the ultimate act of playing with your food, and if it fails, you'll still be able to slather them with butter or even turn them into a bread and butter pudding muffin style. From the Epicurious article on a muffin I didn't even get to mention, what's the story of the morning glory? This muffin has tales to tell. Muffins are best right after they're cooked. If you still have a few muffins around in the following days, Pelicano says, cut them open, griddle and slather them in butter, and you'll be a happy camper still. If you won't or can't eat them quickly, wrap tightly and freeze. They will be great for a few months. Muffins are a beloved treat for good reason and have been so for decades, or you could even say centuries, although they've had a few iterations as we've seen. They aren't constantly going viral, but their popularity in homes throughout the globe can't be denied. They're the ideal portal to eat cake for breakfast, or simply a way for us to use up those bananas sitting in that bowl. There is definitely so much more to say about muffins. Obviously, we didn't go into a bunch of different ones, and I have come across those 4 flavors the most in my just being alive, but I'm sure that there are some that are more popular in some places. Also, I feel that some areas of the globe, savory muffins are bigger than sweet muffins. I think in New Zealand, I always saw a lot of savory muffins, but we're obsessed with baked goods, and I just couldn't mention those because they are not as globally popular. But if you've watched this all the way through, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for watching. Please do like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find this channel, and that I can continue making videos about our favorite desserts or baked goods. In the meantime, thank you so much. I will see you in the next one. Ka kite anō and tschüss.
There's only one banana nut muffin left.
Oh, well, order mine first.
Yeah, but I'm so much faster.
Give it to me.
No.
Give it to me.
Okay, you can have it.